Hello and welcome to Douglas Week 2025, everyone. We're so glad you are all joining us today here online on YouTube for this very special Douglas Dialogues conversation. And you might know me at this point after 5 years of Douglas Week, but I am Dr. Caroline Dunham-Schroeder. I'm the president of the Globe Lane Initiative, who organizes Douglas Week every year. And as you know, if you're tuning in today, Douglas Week is all about celebrating the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass. And not only as a towering figure of the 19th century, but also as a thinker, as a writer, and an activist. And I might add, father as well, because we've talked about the Douglass family a lot as well. And Frederick Douglass, as well as the family, have great relevance today, and their relevance endures and the legacy endures. So conversations like the one today give us the chance to engage with new scholarship, and we're really looking forward to this because we can reflect on Douglass's global vision, and we can consider what his example can mean for us today. And as I said, I'm very excited for this program today, Frederick Douglass, A Life in American History, because today we have the privilege again of hearing from two leading Douglass scholars and Professor Jack Kaufman-McKivigan. Jack, welcome back to Douglass Week. Fifth time, I think, that you're joining us.
Yeah,
And just wanted to tell you a little bit about Jack. Jack is a professor at University Indianapolis. And he's a distinguished historian whose research and teaching have shaped the field of Douglass studies for decades, I would say. Jack is also the Mary O'Brien Gibson Professor of History and Africana Studies at University Indianapolis, and a leading scholar of 19th century America. And I would say he specializes in the history of enslavement or slavery, abolitionism, and reform movements. But Jack will tell you a lot more about this in this conversation. Just might add that Jack also serves as the editor of the Frederick Douglass Papers. And I would say this is an absolute landmark project that preserves and publishes the writings of Douglass for scholars and the public alike. And I'm really looking forward to learning more about that too. And make sure you go check it out. It's here in our comments or in our info for this event. Over the course of this career, Jack has authored and edited really, I can say numerous influential works, and I invite you to read them all because through his work, I know you need a little bit of time for that, but it's worth it because through Jack's work and his research, he has helped shape how generations of students and readers understand the life and legacy of Douglass. And Jack will be joined in conversation today by Professor Mark Christian of City University of New York, whose forthcoming book, and we're borrowing his title for this event because it is about this book and his research, called Frederick Douglass, A Life in American History. And I believe it will be published this year by Bloomsbury, but Mark, you'll probably talk about this more in a minute. And so join us. Yeah, probably, right? and join us. Mark and Jack will explore fresh insights into Douglass activism, and we'll explore with them. And I hope you can use this rare opportunity to learn directly from these scholars and to learn about Douglass not only as an American figure, but also, I would say, as a global figure. So before I hand over, just a warm welcome and a big thank you to you both for joining us today. A very happy Douglass Week to you both. And Jack, I gladly hand over to you, and I'm really excited for this conversation. So thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Carolyn, for inviting me back to this program, which is always exciting to be part of. I've had a long career, as Carolyn told you, with studying Frederick Douglass. I actually joined John W. Blassingame, professor of history at Yale University, in 1979. Blassingame began the Douglass Papers in 1973. So I've been with this project for quite a while. Unfortunately, Professor Blassingame passed away in the year 2001. And before that, when he retired, he turned over the direction of this project to me. But I feel like I'm some ways completing his legacy as well as Frederick Douglass's. We are far along now, finally, after 50 plus years, in publishing a selective edition of Douglass's speeches, autobiographies, correspondence, and journalistic writings. And we've finished two of those three, the speeches and the autobiographies. We have three of the 5 volumes of his correspondence done and one of the 2 volumes of his journalistic writings in print. All these are with the Yale University Press. In fact, we were going to have one more volume is going to come out this year, so we're down to 13 out of 15 of an intended volume series. Recently, or not recently, now it's about 5 years ago, we began a even more ambitious project to move from a selective edition to a comprehensive edition of Douglass's works. We are transcribing and placing online all of Douglass's. First goal is his correspondence. Then we're working on his speeches, and maybe we'll get to those 3,000 plus editorials that he wrote in the course of his career. So it's a very ambitious project. I probably should thank the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Historical Publications and Records Commission. If they still exist today, I haven't checked the news. But as you know, documentary editing is in a perilous state. So if you know any congressmen or senators, please write, say, pass that budget that will refund these projects for future generations of scholars. So that's enough about me and my background. As all of you listening, I'm sure are aware, Douglass had his 200th birthday observation in 2018. And as a result of that time period, there was a proliferation in scholarship on Frederick Douglass. But that hasn't stopped new scholars from writing about Frederick Douglass. And today we are going to talk with one of them. He's already been introduced by Caroline. This is Dr. Mark Christian, who is a professor of Africana Studies at City University of New York. And he's the author of several biographical studies of other important African-American leaders. Why don't I let him give you a short introduction to his own career, and then we'll start asking him some questions about Frederick Douglass. So Mark, tell us about how your background and how that led you to become interested in Frederick Douglass.
Okay, thank you very much, Jack, and thank you for inviting me to the Douglass podcast. I'm very pleased to be here. Carol, just to point out, this book, the biography I did, was published actually in February of this year. So it's already published. I'll have a copy here. Is it in the
so do I.
Okay, all right. So we both know. So my background, as you can tell, I'm not from the Bronx. I'm from Liverpool, England. I was born and raised in Liverpool, England. My father, Jamaican, and he came over to Britain in 1941 as part of the war effort. And he worked in an armaments factory, my father. He met my mother there. They fell in love. She's of British Spanish heritage, and they had 13 children, and I'm number 12. So you can see I come from a very large family, and I have siblings up to 15 years older than me. So I grew up in the 70s around R&B music, and my family is a musical family, and I got very interested in African American history and culture through my listening to African American music of the 1970s and 60s, essentially. My interest in Frederick Douglass, to cut a long story short, I read the second autobiography of him first when I was a younger man, and My Bondage and My Freedom, which came out in 1855. And there's a chapter in there that speaks to his time in Britain, because as you know, he came to Britain in 1845. We can talk about that. I'm sure you have some questions about that later. But my interest in him was that he came to Liverpool from Boston. And I studied American Studies and Sociology for my BA. And an African American scholar came to Liverpool to do a transatlantic study on Boston, Black Atlantic politics on Boston and Liverpool. So I got to know an African American scholar who would then become my mentor, Dr. William E. Nelson from Ohio State. And he was in charge of the Black Studies department there. So a lot of my background is serendipitous, if you like, and my interest in Douglass is part of a mosaic of interest in African American culture. Though I come from the Black British experience, I come out of the Black British experience in Liverpool. Now, this biography, I did first a biography on Booker T. Washington, believe it or not, and it got great reviews, and it won an award from the American Library Association. So with that, they then asked me, would you think about doing one on Frederick Douglass? And I said, yeah, I've always been interested in Frederick Douglass, and I can get into why that a little bit more later as well, depending on the questions. But my this biography comes out of a series of three I will be doing, and I will be finishing with Martin Luther King. The Frederick Douglass was a tremendous experience, just delving into his life and the readings. It's not just his autobiographies, but it's his life itself is just phenomenal. And I'll leave it there for now, Jack, and then you can ask me some questions, and
All
I'll
right.
take it.
All right. I know your book is out because I've read it very thoroughly twice now, so I've
Oh, okay,
enjoyed it.
great.
Now, let me ask you some specific questions about some of the points in there. In your preface, you announce your intention to reinterpret Douglass's life, quote, from the perspective of a Black life in American history, and observe that most existing scholarship on Douglass was written by, and this is true, I know this, white Ivy League educated scholars. Now, because of that,
Yeah.
what do you think of the significant omissions that previous scholars have uh,
Yeah, I think I know you. Yeah,
yeah, I'm
I would
searching for
not
the
say.
right word.
Yeah, yeah. No, well, there's a. It's tricky. It's a tricky subject matter. What I, but to explain this a little bit further from my perspective, the biography series that I was involved with is a Black Lives series in history. So I had to stick to the formula also of the editorial, series of a biography. But what I didn't notice when I started doing a literature review, because when I was at graduate school, I was always taught, be sure to give doff your cap to those who've done the work before, just like yourself, Jack. I copiously reference you, so you know what I'm talking about. But I looked at biographies like the latest one is Blight, David Blight, and he's done some great work, don't get me wrong. But I looked in his acknowledgement section, and there's no mention of James Monroe Gregory's, Frederick May Holland, Booker T. Washington, Charles Chestnut, Benjamin Corliss did a great biography of Frederick in 1948. And Nathan Huggins, John Blassingame, your colleague, did no mention of this pantheon for me of African American scholars. Waldo Martin is mentioned very slightly. Well, what about what about those who've done some great work? And I got a great deal of knowledge reading them. Uh, I could then go to historians who've done a broader analysis, like W.E.B. Du Bois, John Hope Franklin, Benjamin Corliss, again, Vincent Harding. Blassingame has done broader analysis of the African American experience. Henry Louis Gates is I would say he's more mentioned than anybody else. And obviously Rayford Logan. These are names that are very well known in Africana studies. And I think any biographer doing something on Frederick Douglass should at least mention the work that's been done before, because these become invisible. The scholars I've just mentioned would become invisible if I didn't mention them. And we have such a short memory in academia that these scholars could go missing. And my history in Black studies has always been to bring to the center studies that have been marginalized, and that's how I kind of came at Frederick Douglass. I said, well, what about these other scholars? And that's how I wrote about Frederick. That's the foundational kind of Black lives in American history. That was the foundation for me.
Yeah. Well, I noticed we don't have to focus on blight per se, but you did have a really very good section on historical context about put Douglass as an individual into the broader context of African American slave life. And you, I think, correctly faulted earlier predominantly white scholars in their treatment of slavery. Could you give us some examples of where you think your work can?
Well, I'm a Black British guy. I'm from Liverpool, England. I said this is very important. So I say, how do I come at this biography? What qualifies me? And I said, I'd like to go easy on Americans in terms of, the guilt of enslavement, because Frederick Douglass, as you know, is born in 1818. So there's almost 200 years of enslavement in America before he comes into the world. And I don't see those 200 years written, in context, written by other biographers. So I tried to say to the reader, hey, this enslavement is not really an American thing. It was done by the Americans, but it was really put in place very firmly by the British. And why I said that was further down the road, Frederick has this love affair with Britain, which I hope we can get to talk about. He kind of, for me, Frederick looks at everything British through rose-tinted glasses. And I understand that because he was treated so well by the British. But I thought, in terms of a historical context, I had to mention those 200 years in the development of enslavement. And I looked to Thomas Jefferson as a case study. And, for many years, historians ignored the reality of Thomas Jefferson with Sally Hemings. Now, in our day, we accept that Sally Hemings had at least 5 children with Thomas Jefferson. I mean, both families have visited the White House, so I think the DNA evidence has been ratified. They also found a room next to Jefferson that was excavated. It was a lavatory, restrooms, and they took that away and found that this was Sally Hemings's room, and it led right to Jefferson's room. I'm giving an example of the hidden history. And so I wanted to say to Americans, hey, listen, take a bit of guilt away, because this was enslavement in America was firmly entrenched in the British colonies. And I used, I'm just going back to my mind, I used the South Carolina. Do you remember that, John? Jack, the South Carolina after the Stono Rebellion, there was an enactment put in place to really firm up enslavement because they didn't want this happening again. This was after the Stono Rebellion of 1739. I think it's the 1740 Negro Act. It's coming back now. The 1740 Negro Act of South Carolina. And then I say, well, this is before America was born. the Republic of America was born. And I think I've given the reader enough to go, okay, well, this is interesting because Frederick has not even come into the world. And I've
Yeah.
established that, the enslavement, although the founding fathers carried it on, it was in place firmly before the Republic came into being. That was a real part of the historical context. And
Yeah.
I wanted to use the hypocrisy, if you like, of Jefferson, who's a great man, don't get me wrong, but he's got flaws as well.
Yeah.
And I felt historians have ignored that part of American history.
Yeah. Yeah. And because of those flaws, I don't look forward to a Broadway musical about him about Jefferson anytime soon.
Right. Well, yeah. You
Yeah.
know, you've just brought me to something why I got interested in Frederick Douglass for a book. Because in 2015, I went to the Hamilton musical on Broadway, which is about Alexander Hamilton in the
Mm.
1700s. And I was standing there waiting to get into the theater, and I thought of Frederick Douglass. And that's how I did my first chapter. I was trying to do a postmodernist analysis of Frederick. I did it in the previous book called Transatlantic Liverpool, and I did a chapter on Frederick Douglass for that book, and it was like I was trying to use Frederick Douglass's life in relation to my own life as a postmodernist analysis, that like the Hamilton musical, where you've got the 1700s history of America combined with hip hop. It's a very brilliant. I don't know
Yeah.
whether you've seen the musical, but it was quite, I saw the original cast, and it was quite brilliant what they did with history, combining it with African American culture of today. And I
Absolutely.
thought it'd be a good essay to write something on Frederick Douglass coming to Liverpool and then talking about his life in relation to my own life, because I'm very interested in the traveling body, the traveling black body, because Frederick came from Boston to Liverpool and his life becomes much better. Well,
Yes.
yeah, correct. I left Liverpool in 1992 to come to America for opportunity, and my life became better. So there's an
Hmm.
irony there.
Yes.
Because I coming in 147 years after Frederick came to Britain, and I'm thinking of when I travel to when I'm in America, they ask me about the Beatles. Talk about the Beatles, Mark, because
Liverpool. Yes.
I'm from Liverpool. So I said, okay. And I never really studied the Beatles until I come to America. And then I got every album. I got every album, and then I studied them quite well because people were asking me about the Beatles quite often. And I'm saying, when Frederick came to England, he was different, and he was such a charismatic figure that he was embraced in a way I think he doesn't quite understand British
Hmm.
racism from the indigenous part of Britain, you see, because Britain can be deemed just as racist as America. If America is a racist nation, then Britain is too. And this is something that some people don't want to face. But if you're born and raised in Britain, believe you me, and you're of a person of color, then you've experienced aspects of racism. It shouldn't be a surprise. And people
No.
think over here that it's better over there, and it's not quite that simple. It depends on many factors, social factors. So I'll go off your questions, but I could say a lot more about that, Frederick in Britain, you see,
Oh, that's
because it's
fascinating. I'd love to hear more. I remember the essay collection entitled "Liberating Sojourn," and that kind of summed up the thesis very, very appropriately, I thought.
yeah, Frederick, yeah, in Britain, because when he goes to Britain, he he flowers, you know. I mean, but you've got to understand, and he writes so eloquently about being treated. I was never called the N word, and I could walk, I could travel, and I could eat, and I could go into any hotel, and I say, hang on a minute, Frederick, hang on a minute. What about the Cunard Cambria crossing? That was a British vessel, and you weren't allowed to, have your cabin going to Liverpool, and coming back, Frederick. You bought a first class ticket in London, and you asked the guy, will my color be a prescription? Will I have a problem? And the agent in London said, no, you'll have no problem. But when he gets to Liverpool, he can't have that cabin going back to America. So I've jumped the 19 months he had there. But I'm also pointing out the racism in Britain that he faced, but he never, because he writes in his autobiography, he says, as soon as I face back to America, I'm faced with racism. Well, no, you were in Liverpool, England, and it was an agent from
Yeah.
Liverpool who blocked you from having your cabin. That's British racism. That's not American. And the captain was a cool guy, Judkins, the captain of the Cambria. He walks with Frederick to the MacIver was the agent in Water Street. I know Water Street as well as you know Broadway or whatever, or a street in Indiana. I know Water Street very well. You can walk down to the pier head. So I knew, so when I'm reading, I'm going, my God, Frederick and Water Street. I know Water Street so well. And but he's not allowed and yet he's paid first class accommodation.
Yeah.
He's paid for a cabin, and he's not allowed to have that cabin. He can go back, but he goes in steerage. So that's not American racism again. That's a British aspect of racism. No biographer over here has given the analysis I've just given you, because I
Yeah.
don't think you
I don't
you
think,
see.
yeah, I think
Yeah,
you're right.
yeah. So it's always American racism is awful, and it doesn't exist anywhere else. But and Frederick doesn't help us because everything British for Frederick. This is my own main criticism of Frederick in all his work, is that he looks at Britain with rose-tinted glasses. And I understand why. He was treated so well, but he was treated by people who picked him up and were in his company all the time. So no bar would block him or hotel would block him because he's going in with very wealthy,
Mm,
abolitionists, white
true.
abolitionists.
Yeah.
He's in a company of powerful people, so it's it's very interesting. But that's the traveling black body, and he was so unique. And he's dapper, he's well dressed, he's a handsome dude, 6 foot plus. So all of those things, and he's got this beautiful accent and a baritone voice. So obviously, he's going to be an attractive oddity, but he's on his own, Jack. He's on his own. He's not a threat, and he's with a group of whites, so who are powerful whites within the context of social life in Britain. Another thing, well, I'll go to another question, but I've got so much
Yeah.
I
It's
can talk
it.
about.
You've redemonstrated. You brought a different perspective to Douglas, and it opens up some new insights that have escaped earlier scholars. I think that's wonderful.
There's another thing, Jack, if we can stay with that. There's a man in Britain who I do not think gets the credit he deserves. White guy, John Bright, the
Oh yeah.
MP, John Bright. American writers, he's not even mentioned in Blight's book. He's not mentioned. I looked through looking for John Bright. He's not mentioned and look, how can you not mention a guy who gives a third of the cost to Frederick's freedom? how can you not mention a man like that? He's an aristocrat, but he's fighting against the Corn Laws. You know, he's kind of a progressive aristocrat, landowner. Frederick Douglass spoke about 11 times. I know this through your book with Hannah Murray.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I only know, he spoke 11 times in Rochdale. Now, Rochdale's a small town. He only spoke, in his travels, he spoke twice in Liverpool. There's a reason for that, Jack. He spoke in October 1846, 19th of October 1846 was his first, and he spoke to 2,000 people that night, Frederick, in Liverpool. And then but he never stays in Liverpool long. And one of the British colleagues over there was George Thompson. You know George Thompson,
Yeah. Oh,
the
yes, of
British.
course.
Yeah, you know him well. Now George is a Scouser. He's a Liverpudlian like me, George Thompson, and he was a great speaker apparently, and an anti-slaver, an abolitionist, and he spoke over here. And he was with Frederick quite a lot during those 19 months. But he was with Frederick on the night Frederick spoke in Liverpool. But Frederick only spoke once during that 19-month visit to Britain. Why, Jack? Because Liverpool is a deeply slave city town. So there must have been a lot of opposition, even though there was a 2,000 crowd. I imagine there was a lot of hecklers there that night. I imagine it couldn't have been overly friendly, though the ones that were there were probably abolitionists of persuasion. But why didn't Frederick speak more in a massive city like Liverpool, bustling city? Because it's a slave port. It built its wealth out of slavery in Liverpool. So there's another element. Now, Rochdale is about 40 miles east of Liverpool as the crow flies. And he was more than welcome there. He spoke there so many times. And John Bright, Jack, wrote the introduction to one of his final autobiographies. I think the second to last, the 1881.
There was a British edition of his Life and Times of Frederick
Okay,
Douglass, his last autobiography, and Bright wrote an introduction. That's right. John Lobb, I
that's
think, was the
right.
publisher.
That's right. That's right. Okay, so John Bright is writing an introduction even many years after Frederick had been. But John Bright paid £50 towards his £150 freedom. I found that was a very significant thing to highlight in my biography also. And why is he not celebrated? Um,
Oh,
why
absolutely.
is that not highlighted? I'm not
I'll
sure.
just confess that I didn't know that fact until I read your book, and then that really
Ah,
did catch my attention. It's a very good revelation.
okay. Thank you. Yeah. Well, I thought this is, as a scholar, you have to find things that are useful and interesting for people. But I
Yeah.
found that very, very, very important because the two ladies, Elizabeth was Anna Richardson and Elizabeth, I think, Anna and Ellen, I'm
Anna and Ellen.
sorry, Richardson. Yeah, okay. They were the ones raising the funds. Well, John Bright was of Quaker background also, along with them. Those two young women from Newcastle, they went to John Bright, and John Bright gave them £50. So they had a good kitty to start
Yeah, absolutely.
to build up the cost of paying off Thomas Hold for Frederick's freedom. I also this staying with Frederick in Britain and his freedom and the controversy over him buying his freedom. Well, that was done behind Frederick's back, most of it, as you know. But Henry Wright, do you remember Henry Wright, the abolitionist
Yes.
Henry Wright?
Yeah, very
Okay, well,
close to
Henry Wright
Garrison.
was very upset. Yes, he was. He was, and we can talk about Garrison also and Wendell Phillips because they're cool guys for me. And I know Frederick outgrew them, but we should return to that relationship also. But Henry Wright, says, "Why did you do that, Frederick? Why did you sell you don't have to sell your body. You're already free." Henry Wright is being righteous. He's right within the context of humanity, but the way Frederick responds is just brilliant. It's brilliant. It's as good as the letter from Birmingham jailer, in my opinion. It should
Ah,
be
yeah.
literature. Yeah. So what I did in my biography, because as a scholar, Jack, I couldn't find the two of the pieces in one place. I couldn't find Henry Wright criticizing Frederick. It was only in the Liberator. I could only find it in the primary source. So what I did was get them in a contemporary biography so a reader can read Henry Wright's analysis, which is heartfelt, but it's problematic because Frederick needs to be free in order to go and be with his family and not be hauled back into enslavement. But the analysis, just to stay with that, Jack, because it's very important. He says, he says back to Henry, thank you for your letter, Henry. I'm really pleased, but you know, you don't like the passport system. And I agree with you. You don't like the passport system. You think every man and woman should be able to travel wherever they want on this God-given earth, right? But it hasn't stopped you getting a passport, Henry. It had because if you didn't have that passport, you wouldn't have been able to travel. So you don't like the passport, but you still bought the passport. It's a beautiful analysis. It's
Yeah, I see it.
I mean the two letters, yeah, the two letters must be about 7,000. What I would say to any student or any Douglass scholar is put those letters back to back because they're a great analysis on both humanity and the reality of being free in the practicalities of life, And Frederick, those folks who bought his freedom in Britain, Frederick comes back and his shoulders are back and he can go on and do his abolitionist work. And he's only 28, isn't he, when he
Yes.
returns? 29, 1847. He's about
Yeah.
29 years of age. So he's a young, very young man when he comes back, a free man. And then he's able to carry on and do all the work that he did. And phenomenal, phenomenal.
Yeah.
Give me
Yeah.
another question.
Yeah. I mean, it is a great life to study. I was thinking, one problem that I always wrestle with when I teach Douglass to students is the question is how representative of the slave experience is the life of Frederick Douglass, because you can point out all of the ways he got to grow live in Baltimore. Was the playmate of one of the Lloyd children when he was young. Became hired out and got to live on his own. It isn't totally representative, but then you miss the how very representative it was of so many of the horrors and
Yeah,
inhumanity that all
yeah.
enslaved people uh, encountered. So
Experience. Don't forget, you're right. It's like that to me is like, you've got two legs and you're complaining about life, but then you look at a man in a wheelchair or a woman in a wheelchair and they've got no legs. And then you look at your own legs and you realize how worse it could be. But think about it. Frederick has lost his mother by the age of 6. He loves his grandmother and he loses her at the age of 6. She has to take him to the big house. That's a psychological trauma, and he writes about it in his autobiography. That's a lot of pain and loss straight away as a child. Then he has to learn the ways and norms of the big house, and he's hungry. The housekeeper treats him very cruelly, and it's his mother who comes and for the last time they meet, she brings that ginger cake in the shape of a heart. It's the last time he sees her.
Great
But
story.
yeah, his mother protected him and tells this woman, "Hey, you look after my Frederick. You make sure you eat, you know." And so you see that protection of a mother that he would not have after that time. So, and then when he's taken to Baltimore, he is still a young boy. Yes, he learns to, he gets to sleep in a bed for the first time. You know, things do improve, but it's still a horrific experience for those of us in the 21st century looking at that life and going, my God. Because I had a great relationship with my mother. And God forbid if she had been taken from me when I was 6. You know, I had her into my 50s. I had my mother into my 50s. Every ounce of strength I have in me now today as a scholar comes essentially from my mother. I'm saying that Frederick didn't have that.
Yeah.
Frederick had to imagine. So we have to really think about the horrors of enslavement is profoundly that's psychological as well as physical. You know, he
Yeah.
was hungry. He suffered. No, he suffered great. Although in relation to another field hand, he's doing okay. But yeah, hang on a minute. You know, that's tricky
Yeah.
to juxtapose because did you read the section? I think you did, Jack. I'm being rhetorical. The section on Charles Dickens because I put
Yes.
a
Yes.
I
Yeah.
did that
Visiting
on
America.
purpose.
Yes.
Yeah, he visited America in 1842 and he wrote a chapter on slavery. And while he was there, he was picking out, magazines with runaways. And I put in every one that he put in. I put in using public domain because I wanted the reader, if you read those things from Charles Dickens, which is why Frederick liked Charles Dickens. He often
Yes. Very
cited,
much.
yep, yes, he often cited, and I used Charles Dickens again because he was British, you see. So I was coming at it from a British perspective.
I see that.
Uh, yeah, and Charles Dickens was only in his early 30s when he did that American
Hmm.
Notes, which is a travel log. Later on in his life, he became very conservative, Charles Dickens, bordering on racism, because he supported Governor Eyre, Governor Eyre of Jamaica. Don't know whether you know about this, the rebellion in Jamaica, 1865. It's going into another area, but Charles Dickens was supportive of Governor Eyre, and that's not
Didn't
not
know.
cool, not cool at all. That's where Paul Bogle got hung. Paul Bogle. Very Jamaican history. It's very yeah, it's very prominent history. But this American Notes for me was significant to use because again, I didn't see this being used by previous biographers. And Charles Dickens was big for Frederick Douglass. Um, and another peer, two peers, which I was critical of. You see, I'm not a Marxist, yeah, I'm a Marxist. Do you get that, Jack? I'm a Mark.
Yes, I follow that.
Okay, I'm a independent scholar. That's what I'm trying. That's what I try to get across. Because sometimes, if you're in Black Studies, you're labeled on the left, far left. Well, I'm not. You know why I don't like. I'm not into Karl Marx. Why? He was 3 months younger than Frederick Douglass. Can you still hear me? Because you've
Yes.
frozen. Okay. All right. Yeah, I'm worried about my internet. But Karl Marx was born in May of 1818. Frederick Douglass was born in February of 1818. Therefore, Frederick Douglass was only 3 months older. They are peers in big time. And Karl Marx and Engels wrote on the state of the working classes in a book, very important book in the 1840s. They say they are writers. They don't say a word about abolition. They don't say a word in support of Frederick Douglass abolitionists. And Frederick Douglass was making big waves in 1845 to 1848 in Europe. You know, his name was big. So Karl Marx could not have missed the importance of Frederick Douglass. So do you know how I get to that analysis? I'm a sociologist, and I read C. Wright Mills when I was at graduate school, and it had a big effect on me. I said this because I'm always looking for the simplest way to understand the complexity of history. And C. Wright Mills is a sociologist. He died at the age of 46,
Yeah.
unfortunately, a heart attack. But he wrote another study called The Power Elite, and he looked at the military and all in America and how they're all connected, you know, military, government, they marry into each other, the power elite. But the other book he wrote was called The Sociological Imagination, published in 1959. And there's a chapter on biography history. Each of us have a biography, each of us slash have a history. Somebody born in 1900 is not going to have the life of somebody born in 2000. It seems simplistic, but I then say, okay, Frederick is born 1818. Karl Marx is born 1818. Why is not Karl Marx writing about the freedom of Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists? They don't say a word in support. So that's very eye-opening for me. You know, it's very, very important because so many scholars in my field have gone towards Karl Marx like he's a god, you know, just because he broke down capitalism as a system. Yet he may have broken down capitalism as a system, but that doesn't mean he was for the freedom of black people, you know. And so I go at that. I'm probably get some criticism for that because I'm walking on sacred ground for certain people, you know. But I see things independently and I see it for what it is. The great guy, because this is going out in Ireland, I didn't want to forget the Irish scholars, Shaffin and who's the other guy, Fenton. They did two great books on Frederick Douglass because this is going
Right.
to Irish folk. I love the Irish people, by the way. Ireland is very closely connected to Liverpool, as you know. Three of the Beatles had Irish heritage. But why I mentioned Ireland and Frederick Douglass is because Daniel O'Connell was a very big
Oh, yes.
inspiration
Yeah.
for him. So I love, Daniel O'Connell. Frederick loved Daniel O'Connell. Sadly, he died in May of 1847. So just after Frederick got back to America, Daniel O'Connell sadly passed away. But they did meet. They met in Ireland, and he was called the Black O'Connell, which I could go into that for an hour,
Yeah. Yeah.
Jack. Well, we don't. But it was a compliment. And you also know Frederick loved Robert Burns, the poetry of Robert Burns, the Scottish guy, Scottish
Yes.
poet. So,
He
and he
visited
visited
his
his,
home. Yes.
yes, yes, visited his home. So, that's where he picked up the fiddle. He was in Scotland and he was a bit lonely. And Frederick picked up the fiddle out of a store and learned to play it. And he played it all his life. That's another thing that's not really talked about. He was a fiddle player. So, I've mentioned Karl Marx and Engels because a lot of black scholars have followed them like that's the way to liberation. I don't think so. I really don't think so. Because if somebody's born at the same time and doesn't link in with your struggles, they're not part of your struggle, you know. If you know, and they were big on liberation, you know. And I was looking for, did Karl Marx state anything about Frederick Douglass? Why not? He's there at the same time, and no, I don't find anything. So that was important. Um,
Well, yeah, hey, Mark, I have another guest later this week in this
yeah,
program who who I guess will argue some slightly different perspective on that, but that's fine.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. I'm sure. I know. I that will not be popular for me. My perspective on Karl Marx and Frederick Douglass, but they would. They. You ask your guest.
I will.
Yeah, because I'm saying I couldn't find any connection whatsoever between the two of them in terms of, and they should have been connected in writing even. And there's nothing. There's nothing. Should we?
Well,
Do you have
I'll
any?
be sure to bring that up then. Promise.
Yes, yes. Okay.
I had a question for you as a biographer and how that you've studied Booker T. Washington, and I know that Washington wrote a biography of Douglass, as you brought out.
Yes.
How did Washington what inspiration did he draw from Douglass?
Wow. It's so, and you could say the same about W.E.B. Du Bois,
Absolutely.
the two of them. Yeah. I would argue, and then I'll explain. I would argue Frederick Douglass is the father of Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was born in 1856. W.E.B. Du Bois was born in 1868. He's a whippersnapper. There's so much wrong with Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. That debate that has gone right through the century. I found it very problematic. Booker T. Washington was established. He was an established principal. He had 200 faculty and 1,000 students when Du Bois is just coming out of Harvard with his PhD, which means he's a whippersnapper. He's 12 years younger than Booker T. I can't go there, but I'm just giving you that little slight thing there because Du
Mm-hmm.
Bois is the intellectual, and
Oh, yeah.
he's been the godlike figure throughout the 20th century. And sadly, Booker T. Washington couldn't respond because he was dead in 1915. And then
Yes, true.
Du Bois lived such a long life till 95, till 1963. So he's got 50 years of knocking Booker T, and Booker T can't respond. So it's very unfair, very unfair. And I found mendacity in Du Bois's writings of Booker T. Washington. I found clear mendacity. So that's those. But Du Bois is the intellectual. Booker T. Washington is the so-called vocationalist person, the one who built a vocational school. Well, where does Frederick Douglass come in? Frederick Douglass, the practical man, he's seen as an integrationist, but he's also, you could say, he was a separatist because he said Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. She was so successful, it was a multi-million seller, very successful in Britain as well. She writes to Frederick, she says, I'm successful, what can I do for African Americans? Frederick turns round to her and says, we could do with a vocational school for trades. African Americans need a college for trades. Well, why does Frederick think like that? Because Frederick was a corker. He'd spent time on the shipyards. He spent time as a tradesman. So that shouldn't be a surprise to anybody because we only think of Frederick as the writer, as the orator. But before that, he was, on the ships working. So the practical side of Frederick is the Booker T. Washington. Frederick Douglass tried to set up an industrial school. His peers were against it because they didn't want a separation. They wanted an integration. His peers, Frederick Douglass's black peers, were against. But Frederick is saying, no, we got to be practical here. Our people need to be trained. So it's not a generation later. Booker T. Washington picks up that side of Frederick, you see, and starts Tuskegee School. See, And that's the legacy is still with us today. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois, oh my word. Jack, he owes a lot to Frederick Douglass, my friend. He owes a lot. The intellectual side, you see, you read W.E.B. Du Bois, and he's the womanist. He's the first African American, he's the man for empowering women. No, 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 no. That's Frederick Douglass, man. When you think of this phrase, Jack, who comes to mind? The color line.
Hmm. Well, yeah, Douglas has an essay who mentions that.
Who, well, the color line is an essay from Frederick Douglass in 1881 in
Right.
a social science. Yeah, 1881. Bucket W.E.B. Du Bois gets the credit for the color line around the turn of the century with the souls of black folk and writing then, but he never cites Frederick. Go into the books of and the essays of W.E.B. Du Bois, and he's took so much from Frederick's intellect. He mentions him now and again, but not in a deep, I got the color line from Frederick Douglass. I'm very much into this giving kudos to those who've done work in the past. I
Yeah.
don't know whether you've ever been plagiarized, Jack, but I've been plagiarized twice. I was plagiarized by a journalist in England. My very first article, I sent it to this black newspaper in Britain, and the dude wrote an article and never even cited me. So that they apologized to me, but the apology was so small, I needed a magnifying glass, but they did apologize. And then it happened over here in around 2007 with one of my articles. This guy took it like it was his own. So I know that experience of being, having your work snatched away from you or just not being given the kudos for what you've done. So I'm very sensitive to if I read Du Bois and I'm reading him, and he's a brilliant scholar. Don't get me wrong, he's brilliant. But I say, hang on a minute, WEB, you do owe something to Frederick Douglass here. He
Certainly.
was shoulder to shoulder with women. He was at Seneca Falls in 1848. You weren't even born. You were 20 years from being born in 1848. Frederick Douglass is shoulder to shoulder with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and he's voting for the right for them to have the vote. He seconds it at Seneca Falls. He seconds the motion by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. He's
Yes.
30 years of age. And then in the North Star, he goes and writes an article again on the empowerment of women, 1848, the North Star. So that's what my analysis. Frederick Douglass is the father of W.E. He's the grandfather of W.E.B. Du Bois intellectually, and he's the father of Booker T. Washington in terms of the practical side of Frederick, because Frederick combines the both. He had a
Yeah.
life of a laborer, he had the life of a tradesman, he had the life of a skilled orator, and he had the the rest, the
Yeah.
editor, the
It's a remarkable career. It has so many elements combined in it.
yeah, yeah,
There, there's something I'd like to get. I know I'm sensitive to the time, but I
yeah.
noticed that
How long have we got?
you managed to uh, I think very correctly note an analogy to the George Floyd case in your book
Yeah,
that and Douglas of course lived for 30 years after the 13th Amendment, after the decades or more after the 14th and 15th Amendment, and he saw this decline of
yeah,
protections of African American rights. And I think it's a real the lynchings of the 1890s and what
yeah.
happened a decade or less ago about George Floyd. It really is a
Well,
great parallel.
I can come to today, but let's stick with Frederick Douglass in terms of the 1890s. because he's mentoring Ida B. Wells. You're aware of that, Jack. He's a
Yes.
mentor to Ida B. Wells, who was the anti-lynching young lady journalist. And she went to England to give an anti-lynching tour. And it was Frederick Douglass who opened up all the doors for her and raised money for Ida B. Wells to go out there. I say that because we've got to, I wanted to talk about Frederick Douglass and women. He was very much an empowering individual when it came to women. And his wife of 44 years, Anna Murray Douglass, died in I think it's 1882. She passed away.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah.
Okay, 1882, and he remarried. He married Helen Pitts in 1884. I want to say something about the two of them, and then I'll go to the lynching, and I'll go to where we are today, contemporary wise. He loved two women in his lifetime. Oh, I'm sorry. There are other women, so we may not have time to go to Julia Griffiths
Maybe
and
not.
Ottilie Assing. It's too complicated. But he he was attracted to women and women were attracted to him, but he was devoted to his wife of 44 years. Sadly, she didn't learn to read and write. That's a sensitive point for people because they don't want to live because it has connotations of ignorance. She was an intelligent woman, Anna, and he loved her, and they had 5 children together, and she was the rock of his life. Without Anna, he wouldn't have escaped. We know all of that side of it. But she died, and he went into a depression, and he came out of that depression about 18 to 2 years later with the love of Helen Pitts, who was a white woman. And that's what causes a lot of writers don't want to write about it, especially with an African American experience. And I've found I find that black women tend to have a problem with Frederick at that turn in his life. And I say, listen, man, you don't judge people by who they love, and that's just my opinion. But without Anna, you wouldn't have had his freedom and all the things he did. Without Helen, we wouldn't have had his legacy because she saved Cedar Hill. She put a memoriam together that we can read, and we've got Alexander Crummell in this memorial. We've got what happened in Washington, what happened in Rochester, all of those things Helen saved for us to think about, to write about, and to celebrate Frederick Douglass. Without Helen Pitts, I didn't even know she was buried next to Frederick. I stumbled on that because she's so hidden from the history. It's so I wrote about Helen and I said, listen, without Helen Douglass, we wouldn't have had the Cedar Hill. I visited Cedar Hill. That's his last home in Washington, Anacostia. I visited there in 2003. And then 21 years ago, last year, I visited her again for this biography to get a feel of Frederick again. So without Helen, I wouldn't have been able to do that,
True.
and future generations will not be able to do it. She didn't even put her name on that memoriam book. The memoriam book, Jack,
Yes.
we're all, where the funeral and all the poetry and all the people, what they said, the beautiful things they said about Frederick, all of that would have been missing without her keeping hold of his legacy. So I think it's time for scholars to write about Helen just as much as they write about Anna, because I think he loved two women, the women he married, he loved.
Hmm.
And he was with Helen for 11 years. She was standing next to him when he passed away. And
Yes.
That's it. Now, the thing about black women having a problem with Frederick, and I think this is where Ida B. Wells comes in. Ida B. Wells went to visit Frederick Douglass, and they developed a friendship. And he loved her, she loved him. And she writes Ida B. Wells writes about meeting Frederick and Helen in their home, and what she was taken aback with was how well they loved each other, how well they took care of each other. And Ida B. Wells is a very, very strong African American
Oh, yeah.
woman who married an African American man. Right. It's so if anyone's going to endorse Helen, it's going to be Ida B. Wells, who the anti-lynching, and I think black women should read Ida B. Wells before they critique Frederick Douglass and his marriage to Helen Pitts. That's what I'd like to say. Now, bringing us forward, what would Frederick say about today? We are in hell. I mean, this is a hellish period in the history of humanity. And we're dealing with a backlash to George Floyd. George Floyd created a movement that was global. There were white people marching in Paris, London, Italy, all around the world for the blatant murder of George Floyd. I think it goes back a bit further from George as well. I think it goes back to Barack Obama. I think Barack Obama, being the president, created the Tea Party, and the Tea Party created, in a way, the support for Trump. But this attack on liberal arts, this attack on Black history. I mean, we've spent a solid hour talking about Frederick Douglass from the 19th century, and we've scratched the surface. You and I could go on talking for another 2, 3 hours comfortably.
Absolutely.
And we're talking about one historical figure that's American history and British history. It's all students, if they read and understood the work you've done, Jack, and my biography alone would get so much inspiration. Yet that's being denied by contemporary, um, I would say, terrible politicians who've got an agenda that appears to me to be very anti liberal arts in general, and, and particularly to people of color history. How we don't know how this is going to turn out as well. What happened the other day was terrible to that young man,
Agree.
Charlie Kirk. What happened? That was ugly at its ugliest of humanity. To do that to somebody was doesn't matter our political domain. That this is what I'm saying. We are in hell if we cannot articulate ideas in a so-called democracy, and we're heading to the 250th year of the American Republic next year. Can you imagine what it's going to be like? I mean, it's going to be it's going to be a gigantic nightmare. The way
Yeah.
if the people in charge are going to shape it, I've just read today, JD Vance, we're going after all liberal organizations. We're
Yeah.
going after all that. Does that sound American to you? I
No,
mean,
no,
it's
no,
I
no.
started. I first gave a talk in February on this autobiography. Sorry, this biography. And I started with the Constitution. I said, listen, everybody should read the Declaration of Independence, because you'll see, look, it's this is the Declaration of Independence. This is as American as apple pie and cherry pie. This is the document that everybody loves if you're an American. And I was born in England, you know, but it says, look, and the Declaration, this man in the office doesn't even understand the Declaration of Independence. He doesn't even understand it. And it's on his wall in the Oval Office. So look,
Yeah.
you've got me going now, man. You're asking me about George Floyd. It goes it goes much deeper.
Yeah.
And I said to people, look, don't don't listen to me. Read the Declaration of Independence and why you became a republic. And you'll say you didn't want a king and you're upset with King George III. And, and he's establishing all kinds of, he, he has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing to assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. Who does that sound like today?
Yes, yeah.
He has,
Sadly, history repeats itself.
this history is repeating itself. Look at this one. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their officers and the amount
Oh
of
no.
payment of their salaries. This is 1776. And the
Yeah.
last one, I'll just, because it's a whole list. He has erected a multitude of new officers and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their subsistence. My
Wow.
God,
Wow. What parallels are
my
just
God.
frightening.
The parallels are frightening, and that's the I'm not reading Mark Christian. I'm reading the Declaration of
Yeah.
Independence.
Yeah.
So any of
Which
your
was Douglas's favorite document as well. Yeah. You know,
there you go.
in your book, you mentioned at the very end of his life that Lessons of the Hour address is
That,
very powerful.
yeah,
And one thing that we can agree, Douglas is hopeful right up to the end that if the country can rededicate itself to its fundamental principles, we have a great future in front of us. But if we forget that,
we
it's hell
forget
to
that.
pay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's America, as you know, you've studied Jack very deeply. America is only 250 years old next year. That's a very, very young empire. And I
Mm.
think right now, your nation, this nation has never had such an assault on its checks and balances. And if you let it go, you could slip down a very ugly road. A lot of people, you need to. I said to people, study the Declaration of Independence. Just read it. It's 4 or 5 pages because a lot of people don't read, Jack. They don't read. You have to point these things out. And I said to them, read the Enabling Act of the
Yeah.
Nazis of 1933, the Enabling Act. Just read what they did to break down German society so that Hitler could be a dictator. And I
Mm.
think I can't say enough about Frederick he'd be fighting with us,
I
he'd be
agree. I
fighting with
agree. He would
us.
be on the
So
streets.
I don't know. Yeah. How long do
Well,
we have
no, Mark,
left?
I think we were running out of time. I just want to thank you. This has been very thought provoking and bringing it right up to the present
Yeah,
is excellent. It's a book that, that you bring some great new insights into the study of Douglas by you know, the, your Black, Afro-British and Afro-Caribbean perspectives, really
yeah.
brought some new ideas to me. And I spent 50 years studying Frederick Douglass, and I really appreciate that. And that's why I'm
Well,
keeping this book very close to me from now on. Every time I look at Douglass, I want to see what you've had to say about it. So, and I
yeah.
encourage
I,
everybody listening to take a look at this great study.
well, Jack, coming from you, who goes right back to John Blassingame, that is a
Mm,
hell of a
great name.
compliment. And I thank you,
Yeah.
sir. I thank you very much, sir, and I've so enjoyed our conversation. But there's so much more. We didn't talk about Douglas, the
Oh,
self-made man.
we,
There's so much we haven't touched on.
well,
But
maybe they'll invite
that's
us
our dream.
back sometime. And
Yeah, maybe they'll invite us back. Okay. All right, Jack. All right,
all
We
Jack.
right.
sure will. We sure will, guys. And I just wanted to say thank you so much, Jack and Mark, for such a rich and thought-provoking discussion. I think we can all agree that we've learned so many new insights about Douglass, and not only about, his life and his activism in the US, but also specifically, and that part is really close to our hearts as well, his time in the UK and in Ireland. And because Douglass Week is always anchored in Ireland, and Douglass Week
Yeah.
itself began in Cork. So I too only wish we had more time to keep this conversation going, but we will invite you back because I think there is a lot more to talk about. And I truly look forward to future opportunities. And of course, we're excited, Mark, that your book is out already, and we'll put the link here so that people can read it as soon as possible. And on behalf of Douglass Week, just thank you again both for your time today, for sharing with our audiences, and we look forward to more.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
All right.